Hey, everybody. Todd Connor here with Veterans for Political Innovation. We are very excited in our continuing series of hosted conversations to be talking to Seth David Radwell. Seth, thank you for being with us on the podcast here.
Todd, thank you so much. It's a pleasure, and I'm glad to be with you.
Okay, so Seth has an incredibly interesting background. He's the author of American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation. And we're going to get into a conversation about what the American Schism is, how we got here, how we find ourselves, how do we get out of the American Schism. But also interesting for our audience is that you're an internationally known business executive and thought leader in consumer marketing. So you served as CEO of the Proactive Company, a leading skincare brand. And then prior to that, you served as president and chief revenue officer of Guthrie Renker and president of East Scholastica. So interesting and expansive business career. How did you go from being a business leader and running these known consumer brand companies into this work of researching and then writing a book?
Well, it was quite an interesting journey. My whole career, frankly, has been in business and in direct marketing. I've led many consumer brands, as you mentioned. But about 4 years ago now, I was growing increasingly concerned about the state of our democracy and what was happening to the country. And so I actually left my career and took a detour to do research that ultimately led to American Schism. So it was a conscious decision, mostly because I'm concerned and remain concerned today that we will not be able to hand democracy to our kids.
So you set off on this sort of intellectual journey to sort of wonder what's going on. What were the threads that you followed, and what was the thesis that you either had then or in time developed about what's going on?
Yeah, I had some hypotheses going in. I mean, I knew that America has, to a large degree, always been very divided. So the notion that we're in some unique territory now, being so divisive, I knew that wasn't quite right. And in fact, my belief was that history can act as a salve for our wounds if we would only apply it. So it was an investigative tracing. I went back to find out where the initial American divide came from, what I call the American Schism. And that led me back to the founding of the country, where I believe the original American Schism happened. And I traced that schism through our history up until today.
So what is the schism? What was the original schism? What is it today?
Well, it's fascinating. First of all, the schism has to do with the two different, very competing visions for what this country should be, which was this competition was playing out at our founding during the Enlightenment. And there were, at that time, the Enlightenment, of course, was a very important era in history for modern society. But the model of the political philosophy during the Enlightenment was the social contract. And there were two very different views of what our social contract, the American experiment, should look like. And on one hand, just to make it simple for your listeners, who I hope are interested in history, there was what I call the moderate Enlightenment, which were people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. And then there were the more radicals, people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Paine. And there were many differences between them. But the schism happened because the radicals really believed in a social contract characterized by a representative democracy, a government of the people, decentralized. And the moderates were very much in favor of what at the time was called an aristocratic republic, meaning a republic where the aristocrats, the learned, the elite, like themselves, governed. And, that was the basic difference in the governing model between these two groups. Now, another key aspect between the radicals and the moderates, what was their stance on religion? It was the radicals who had documented how for centuries in Europe, especially, the monarchy and the church had colluded to oppress the people. And so it was very much, Jeffersonian to come up with this notion of a separation of church and state, that the church and the civic affairs be separate realms. So those two differences, the notion of a democratic republic and of a separation of church and state, were behind the kind of the radical Enlightenment view. And that became, of course, the Democratic Republican Party, Jefferson's party. Whereas the other point of view was this strong central government advocated by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and others, where the federal government had a big role to play. And it was very much, they were the leader. The leaders were very much elected people who had experience. That was the first American schism.
Mm-hmm.
And it became the Federalist Party, by the way. It was it was the battle between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson.
So how does that original tension play out since the founding, and what does it look like maybe today?
Sure. So what the book does is it creates this framework and explains it in detail, how those two forces, if you will, conflicted originally, and how they did so over 5 epochs of our history, discrete episodes. And today, it's very relevant. Today, I would say that there's a little bit of a twist on it, and that there are 3 forces kind of at war. One is this notion of an egalitarian democratic republic, which is bottom-up representative democracy. Another is this notion of a more aristocratic or elite republic, where there's the establishment that governs. And then a third force that became clear in the 18th century was what I call the counter-enlightenment, meaning a group of people that increasingly felt that faith was the answer, and that enlightenment alone, reason alone, was not sufficient for the civic governing arena. And so that counter-enlightenment force is also very, very applicable today.
So most folks, when we think about today's kind of political environment, go to like the 2-party system. You're talking about something a little bit more philosophical, foundational. How do you see this sort of the Enlightenment schism and the 2 camps, or maybe the 3 camps that we see today? How does that play out in our politics, or do you see it as playing out in our politics?
Sure. Oh, it's very relevant. The book describes it in detail. So for example, I mean, I think the core establishment, that kind of the center right, center left, has very much kind of a moderate view of what the political civic arena should look like, the social contract, which is that there are institutions that have been built that are led by educated people who are qualified. We very much have a meritocracy where those who do well, both in the civic arena and in business, are rewarded. And I think that's kind of the core model. Now, what you're seeing today is a populist movement coming from both the left and the right, which rejects that elitist view of society. Many people in the neoliberalistic model, the global model that we've adopted for the last 5 decades, both parties have adopted this. It's very much left people behind. And there are many Americans who feel that the political structure and institutions have let them down. And I think, what Trump so effectively tapped into was this discontent with the governing establishment. And so that very much is a more populist movement that's swelled up from the ground and is being very much driven today by anti-government, anti-elite sentiment, as an example.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And the book is phenomenal, and it's extensive. It's a tome. It's 500 pages, and we are going to encourage folks to pick it up and read it, because it's a fascinating read and a fascinating reframe. Because I think part of what we're being told is that this is sort of like a 2-sided story, and it's left versus the right. But you actually paint a picture that is much more about a moderate kind of governing ethos, which is anchored in sort of the moderate, what you might call like the moderate Enlightenment philosophy, and that there are in fact folks on either side of that extreme that are maybe have more in common than would otherwise be acknowledged. Is that fair?
Correct? I mean, I think what the book goes into this in great detail in this short conversation there's really 3 books in one. It has this framework, then it has this tracing of history, and the third part of the book very much distills core issues and recommends a plan forward to get out of this mess. But if I can, I think your point's exactly right in that the political discourse in the U.S. today has collapsed. We're in a situation where reason and problem solving have been crowded out by acrimony and rancor. And we're no longer having a productive political discourse. And that's why we're in such dangerous times. And so why I think the book has been important, and it's won quite a few awards, is because I think it addresses how we get out of the situation we're in and move towards a more productive conversation that both follows people's passions and beliefs, but also anchors solutions in compromise and reason. One of the things, Todd, the book shows is that over the course of our history, we've had many, many disagreements. And at times, we've used a structure like a secret sauce, a formula for how to work through them, which has been quite productive. And at other times, we haven't used that formula. We've abandoned it. And what you see is that in the situation where we've abandoned it, we ended up creating situations of terrible violence and harm. Whereas when we use this more reasoned compromise-based formula, we've had better outcomes. And my fear is that we're moving towards the more violent, less productive side of the battlefield today.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about solutions, because I think our audiences, we're fixated on solutions, because I think we're also in this time and place where we can sort of stay in our corners and feel outraged, but I think we are trying to kind of move beyond that and figure out what the solutions are. So the book does a great job of articulating this in great detail, but there are both sort of cultural, behavioral elements of this, and then there are some very tactical things that we can be doing. Can you talk about some of both?
Yes. So the third part of the book lays out a plan, which has 2 overall components. One is a set of kind of mindset changes, or how we interact with each other as Americans. And the other side are specific structural changes that would make sense because some of the structures of our democratic institutions have outgrown their usefulness. They failed us. And so I think I'll talk about both of those for a second. Yeah. I mean, in many ways, the mindset cultural changes will take a longer time, but are the most important because, we're in a world now where we don't really listen to each other and interact in a productive way. We're operating in a digitally driven world through Twitter and other platforms, and where people shout at each other and feel like they're part of a team or a tribe. A lot's been written about this. Mm-hmm. And there's no doubt that as human beings, we all have this amygdala-driven primitive drive to be part of an in-group and attack an out-group. It's why, Todd, so many of us love to watch a football game, because it feels great to cheer on your team and attack the other guy. But what I say in the book is that's not the best framework for actual problem solving. And we have to get out of this mindset of how we listen and talk to each other. And I'm working actually with groups that do this, groups like Braver Angels and others, No Labels, that are nonpartisan, that bring people together in a room often, or at least in a Zoom conference where they can talk to each other in a way that's respectful and seeks to understand other points of view. And I think that's what's missing, is this kind of civilizing interactivity, or getting to know each other and understanding what we have in common. Of course, we have differences. We'll always have differences. But that mindset piece is key. And I'm actually working with some organizations that are trying to foster a real mindset change. In fact, it's funny. Sometimes when I do talks and I get these questions that you'll often hear on cable news, I reject all of that. I mean, my goal is to understand ideas and appreciate all points of view, both left and right. And my feeling is that what the book talks about is that the extremes on both sides are drowning out the conversation, because that's what gets amplified on media. The people who are shouting, whether it's on the left about cancel culture or the right about not dealing with reality, but both sides are counterproductive. And I want to talk to people who are interested in problem solving and finding solutions. And I think my research, in fact, Todd, shows that 70% of Americans are part of what I call the frustrated majority, meaning that most of us, 70%, do believe that we need some form of compromise and reason to get problem solved, and that we have to learn how to work through these issues. Whereas the 30% on the extremes on each side would rather tear stuff apart. So I'm trying to reach the 70% frustrated majority who believe that we have more in common than not, and would like to see us continue the American experiment.
Yeah. Yeah, and that we are in some cases, and when you pull people out and you put them into IRL in real life, you find out that we're almost being told a narrative of our divisiveness that doesn't actually hold up when you pressure test it against everyday people living their lives. Okay,
that's right.
So that's the mindset shift.
Right.
Talk about some of the structural solutions. Like if you had a magic wand, what would you change to?
Well, this is very interesting. So the structural, first of all, you have to say that one of the things the book shows is that, the Constitution as a blueprint was written to fulfill the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, our credo as a nation. And it was meant to be modified because the founders understood that it could never solve all the problems that would eventually happen. They couldn't foresee how society and civilization would develop. So the first thing is that the whole idea of the Constitution is that it's modifiable. Now, there are certain things that clearly are counterproductive. One thing I talk a lot about in the book is the media models. The way the incentive models in media, the way they work is they incentivize outrage, because outrage gets more attention and more clicks and more viewers. And, I'm not saying, the government can't take over information or news, but there can be new media models with better incentives. And so one of the structural changes, to use your point, is the idea of changing incentives in the media world. And we've done this before. For many decades, we had what was called the fairness doctrine, which established a better balance. Many of your listeners are probably too young to remember the Walter Cronkites of the world, but there used to be actual news on TV. One example is structural changes in media. But let me go to another one in the political arena. I think the documentation shows that today, at least at the federal level, more time and money is being spent by officials getting reelected than in solving problems. Mm-hmm. And so I believe a very strong case can be made for term limits. The whole political industry is somewhat broken. And I think both parties are guilty of this, between gerrymandering and a whole other bunch of stuff. So I think establishing term limits would be a very good structural change. Another one that I talk a lot about in the book is the notion of ranked choice voting, or changing how our voting system works, because in many ways our voting system has very peculiarities, very particular things that make it counterproductive. And there's research that shows that ranked choice voting, for example, is a much better system because it gives consumers, in this case citizens, more choice, more direct influence. In simple terms, the way it works is if there's 5 candidates, first of all, because you don't only have 2 parties, you have more, so you have more ideas in the mix. Mm-hmm. And then because you rank choice your votes, if your first choice falls out, your second choice counts. It's not thrown away. See, today when a third party candidate is in a race, it's usually as a spoiler. It doesn't really help. So ranked choice voting is a simple structural change that's starting to happen, actually, that could be very productive. And the book has other ones besides term limits and ranked choice voting. I mean, I do think that we need some change to the Electoral College, to some of our actual institutions, which will be harder because some of those require amendments, et cetera. But the book lays out a handful of these structural changes.
Well, and it's interesting. I read a piece the other week of talking about how America tends to renew its democratic systems, once a generation, and how historically that's been around who gets to participate. And so women get the right to vote and African Americans get the right to vote, but that we might be in an era less around who and more around like how, and that it's the systems of democracy that are sort of up for debate. And I think this is what your book pokes at, and it's certainly what we're on a mission to elevate, is the conversation around how do these systems work. I took a business class, and you'll appreciate this. This is the only thing I remember from tax accounting at the University of Chicago Business School was the professor said complicated tax structures benefit the rich. And I think about elections, complicated democracy systems benefit incumbent power, right? And so
absolutely, that's exactly the right insight.
Yeah, and so how do we create simplicity and access? And I think that's a goal. Okay, so Seth, let me ask you this. Maybe this will be the final question, but and we're going to encourage folks to, again, get the book and read the book, because it's just.
And I'd love to hear from folks. They can reach out to me at SethDavidRadwell.com to ask questions. I love to hear from readers and discuss these issues, because I think the conversation itself is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here's my, I guess, final question is, like, what's your challenge or advice for citizens in this moment, and maybe particular, military veterans that are listening?
Well, first of all, military veterans are. I'm so enamored with folks who've given service to the country. So, I would thank all the veterans listening for what they fought to defend or put themselves on the line to defend. And it's precisely that I appeal to. I mean, I think we, for all of our faults, the American experiment has been the most successful experience in self-governance in the history of the world. And it has all of its flaws and problems, but I think it's worth fighting for. I think we should re-embrace our democratic norms and reestablish a commitment to a democratic republic and what that means. And so, what I would say to people listening is, there's a lot of push now to take some extreme and whether it's following a conspiracy theory or trying to cancel someone out, those things tend not to be helpful. What's helpful is really to engage and kind of change your mindset and be open to new ideas. And so I guess my appeal, and what I'm trying to do through my speeches and my talking, is getting different communities of Americans who make up this frustrated majority to have a renewed commitment to dialogue and to problem solving in the public sector.
Outstanding. Seth, we could talk for much longer, but this has been a great primer. The book is American Schism: How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation. SethDavidRadwell.com is where you can engage with Seth. We'll include links on how to get the book. And Seth, we'd love to continue the conversation. So just thank you for your patriotism in this moment. It means a lot. So this has been great. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. It's a pleasure to be with you.